More people died on the Sultana than on the Titanic. Take a moment with that. The Titanic, the most famous maritime disaster in history, 100 films, $1 billion cultural monument, a name every child knows, and the Sultana killed more people. By most historians' estimates, somewhere between 1,500 and 1,800 men died in the Mississippi River on the night of April 27, 1865. The lowest confirmed count is 1,221. The Titanic lost 1,512. You've heard of the Titanic. You've probably never heard of the Sultana. That's not an accident. There's a photograph. It was taken the day before the explosion, at Helena, Arkansas, by a man named Thomas Bankus. The boat is sitting at the dock, and what you see when you look at it, what lands in your chest before your brain even processes it, is that you cannot see the boat. You can only see men, packed across every visible surface, standing on the railings, sitting on the rooftop, shoulder to shoulder on every deck. 2,000 men crammed onto a vessel built to hold 376. Most of them were coming home from Confederate prison camps. Most of them had been starving for months. Most of them could not swim. How does the worst maritime disaster in American history, worse than the Titanic, worse than anything before or since in American waters, disappear so completely from the national memory that most people who hear about it today think it sounds made up? That's the question this whole story is trying to answer. And the answer, when you finally get there, is not comforting. And before we move on, if this kind of history matters to you, please subscribe and hit the like button. It keeps this channel alive. Thank you. To understand what happened on the Sultana, you have to understand what these men had already been through. Because this is not, at its heart, a story about a boat. It is a story about men who survived the unsurvivable and then were killed on the last night before they reached home. Andersonville, Georgia, February 1864. The Confederacy builds a prison camp on 16.5 acres of pine forest in southwest Georgia. It is designed for 10,000 prisoners. By August of that year, it holds 33,000. There is no shelter. There is no roof. There are no barracks. The men sleep in the open, in rain, in mud, in summer heat that reaches 100 degrees, and in winter cold that drops below freezing. The only water source is a creek, the same creek that serves as the camp's open latrine. At Andersonville's worst, in August 1864, 2,997 men died in a single month. On one day alone, one August day, 207 men breathed their last. Of the 45,000 Union soldiers who passed through Andersonville over 14 months, nearly 13,000 did not leave alive. One prisoner, Robert Kellogg, wrote of his arrival. A spectacle met our eyes that almost froze our blood with horror and made our hearts fail within us. The camp commandant, Henry Wirtz, was hanged after the war for war crimes. He was one of the only Confederates executed. That tells you something about what Andersonville was. Cahaba, Alabama was smaller, but no different in kind. Overcrowded, disease-ridden, men withering on inadequate rations in inadequate space. The men who survived these places, who lasted through the dysentery and the scurvy and the starvation and the cold, were marched overland to Vicksburg, Mississippi in the spring of 1865. Some walked 40 miles on foot to get there. Many were still seriously ill. They were young, some as young as 14, gaunt, in tattered clothes, and they were the ones who had made it. When the survivors came in sight of the Mississippi River at Vicksburg, they shouted and sang with joy. The war was ending. Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox on April 9th. The men were free. The government had arranged for steamboats to carry them north up the river, back to Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Tennessee, back to their families, back to their lives. There were 3 steamboats docked at Vicksburg at the time: the Lady Gay, the Pauline Carroll, and the Sultana. The Lady Gay and the Pauline Carroll left Vicksburg empty. No freed prisoners. Plenty of room. All of the men went on to the Sultana. The Sultana was a side-wheel steamboat, 260 feet long, built in Cincinnati in 1863, 2 years old at the time of the disaster. She was a handsome boat, fast. She'd made the fastest upriver run of any steamboat of her time, and in honor of that, A set of elk's antlers were mounted between her twin smokestacks, a symbol of speed that any riverman could read from a distance. Her captain was James Cass Mason, 34 years old, part owner of the vessel. Mason was a good captain who had found himself in a bad financial situation. The war had disrupted Mississippi trade. By 1865, Mason was hurting. Then the U.S. government announced it would pay steamboat captains to carry the freed prisoners north. $5 per enlisted man, $10 per officer, per 100 miles of transport. A full load of men could pay Mason over $2,500, more than $40,000 in today's money. For a captain desperate for cash, it was a lifeline. But the Sultana had a problem. About 100 miles below Vicksburg, one of her 4 boilers had developed a bulge, a leak. Chief Engineer Nathan Wintringer knew it. When the boat limped into Vicksburg on April 23rd, they brought in a local boilermaker to assess the damage. His name was R.G. Taylor. Taylor looked at the boiler. He looked at the burnt, blistered iron plates. A boiler already repaired once in Natchez the month before, already retubed, meaning the interior tubes were fine but the outer shell was failing. Not yet 3 years old and already on its second set of emergency repairs. Taylor told them what he found. The repair, done properly, would take at least a week. Ideally, the boiler should be replaced entirely. Mason told him to patch it. Taylor complied. He hammered a thin plate, roughly 8 inches by 24 inches, 5/16 of an inch thick, over the breach and riveted it down. When he was done, according to court testimony gathered afterward by attorney and Sultana historian Jerry Potter, Taylor turned to Captain Mason and told him plainly, "The boiler isn't safe." Mason said not to worry. They'd fix it properly in St. Louis. At the same time, in the same port, on the same day, Captain Reuben Benton Hatch, the chief quartermaster at Vicksburg, was approaching Mason with a different kind of offer. Hatch controlled the flow of prisoners to the transport boats. He could guarantee Mason a full load, 1,000 men, maybe more, if Mason agreed to cut him in on the government payment. Both men knew the Sultana was rated for 376 passengers. Neither man mentioned it. Mason took the deal. Here's what the boat looked like when it left Vicksburg on the evening of April 24, 1865. And here's the question worth holding as you picture it. At what point does dangerous become fatal? The main deck, the middle deck, the hurricane deck, every surface was packed with men. A cotton merchant named William Butler, watching from the dock, said later, "On every part of her, the men seemed to be packed in as thick as they could well stand. They were on the hurricane deck, on her wheelhouse, forward deck and guard, and a person could go from one part of the boat to another only with much difficulty. The men had survived Andersonville. They were used to crowding. But this was different. Many were afraid to leave their sleeping spot because they couldn't get back to it. Some removed boards from the paddle wheel housing to use as a makeshift toilet rather than lose their place on the deck. The boat rode low in the water from the weight. She tilted as crowds shifted. Mason had to issue a standing order to the men. Stop rushing to one side to wave at passing boats. The sudden shifts in weight were rocking the hull and sloshing the water inside the already compromised boiler. There was one lifeboat aboard, a few life preservers. In Memphis, on the evening of April 26th, approximately 300,000 pounds of sugar were unloaded from the hold. The sugar had been riding low in the cargo bay, acting as ballast, keeping the weight balanced and the center of gravity down. Without it, the Sultana was top-heavy. The overcrowded upper decks now pressed down on a boat with no counterweight. The one thing keeping her stable was gone. That was the line. The men were happy. They sang. Some played cards. One man, Jonathan Robbins of Michigan, from the 18th Michigan Infantry, had written a letter 12 days earlier from Vicksburg. It was full of the particular joy of a man who has survived something enormous and can finally see home. He would not arrive. Just after midnight on April 27th, the Sultana left Memphis, crossed the river to the Arkansas side to take on coal, and turned north. The Mississippi was at spring flood stage, swollen with snowmelt from upriver, running fast and cold, full of debris. The current was fighting her. The boilers were straining. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. The men were sleeping when it happened. The boilers exploded in rapid succession. 1, then two more, a split second apart. The explosion came from the upper rear section of the boilers and drove upward at a 45-degree angle, tearing through the crowded decks above it like a shell through paper. The pilot house, the room where the pilot stood, the room from which the boat was steered, was destroyed instantly. Without a pilot, the Sultana had no one at the wheel. The men packed nearest the boilers, soldiers from Kentucky and Tennessee who had been assigned that area, were killed in the first seconds. Not drowned, not burned, killed by shrapnel, by steam, by the physical force of the blast. Steam at boiler pressure does not burn the way fire burns. It cooks, it dissolves. It is fast, and it leaves nothing behind to recognize. The starboard smokestack fell backward into the blast hole. The port smokestack fell forward onto the crowded upper deck. The upper deck collapsed onto the middle deck. The broken wood fell into the exposed furnace boxes and caught. One Ohio survivor wrote it down later, in a book of collected testimonies published in 1892. When I came to my senses, I found myself surrounded by wreckage and in the midst of smoke and fire. The agonizing shrieks and groans of the injured and dying were heart-rending, and the stench of burning flesh was intolerable and beyond my power of description. Another. There were some killed in the explosion, lying in the bottom of the boat, being trampled upon, while some were crying and praying, many were cursing while others were singing. That sight I shall never forget. I often see it in my sleep and wake with a start. Jerry Potter, the Memphis attorney, who has spent 40 years in this history, reading every page of the court-martial records, walking the banks of the river, has said, "You hear story after story after story of the survivors who said they could hear the screaming of the people trapped in the wreckage, but there was nothing they could do. In 20 minutes, the entire superstructure was burning. The river was dark. The Mississippi was at flood stage, running fast, carrying trees and debris in the current. The water was cold, not the brutal cold of winter, but the cold of snowmelt in April, cold enough to kill a weakened man in minutes. The Sultana had covered roughly 7 miles north of Memphis when she blew. The current would carry the survivors and the dead back south. Men jumped. Men who had been sleeping moments ago, who had survived Andersonville, who had survived the march to Vicksburg, who had felt the joy of the river and the singing on the decks, jumped into the dark water of a river they didn't know, in the dark, weakened by months of starvation, most of them unable to swim. The survivors panicked. They clung to anything. Doors, shutters, pieces of deck planking, they clung to each other. Whole groups, locked together, went down together. The men in the water fought, not from cruelty, but from the oldest animal fear, fought over pieces of wreckage, fought over planks and barrels and anything that would float. Chester Berry, himself a survivor, wrote that in those first hours the men fought each other as desperately as they fought the river. One man floated 10 miles on the back of a dead mule. Another survivor later recalled that there was at least one person clinging to every flooded tree along the Arkansas shore. There was a woman aboard. Her name was never recorded. She worked for the Christian Commission, a precursor to the American Red Cross, and she had been on the Sultana to minister to the sick soldiers. In the minutes after the explosion, men panicked at the bow of the burning boat, clinging to the chains and ropes, pulling at each other in their terror. She spoke to them. She calmed them. She kept them from pulling each other into the water, for as long as she could in the middle of that burning, screaming darkness. She kept the men around her from losing their minds. The fire reached her. She let go. The engineer on duty that night was named Samuel Clemens. Not the famous author, but an ordinary man doing an ordinary job on what had been an ordinary night. He was severely scalded in the explosion. He survived long enough to make it to shore. He gave his testimony to the first investigators, and then he died. The passing steamer Bostona No. 2 arrived about 30 minutes after the explosion, came upon the burning wreck in the dark, and immediately began throwing anything that would float into the water: doors, shutters, stage planks, chairs, and pulled approximately 150 people from the river. The captain headed back to Memphis to raise the alarm. In Memphis, the alarm was already raising itself. Sultana survivors had begun floating past the Memphis waterfront. Men in the water, in the dark, calling out, and the crews of docked steamboats had noticed. Their boilers were cold. They sent rowboats. A man named John Fogelman lived on the Arkansas bank, Confederate territory for most of the war. He heard the explosion. He looked out at the burning river, and then he lashed logs together and floated out into the dark toward the fire. He came back with men. He went out again. He came back again. He rescued 25 survivors and kept every one of them at his farm for days. Franklin Hardin Barton, on the same shore, had spent the last 4 years patrolling that river, looking for Union soldiers to report or capture. That night, he led rescue efforts until dawn. Think about what that means. The men in the water burned, freezing, barely able to stay afloat, were being pulled out by men who would have shot them 6 weeks earlier. The war had ended 18 days ago. Apparently that was enough. It is, in its way, the most remarkable thing in this entire story, and it was completely unreported. Which brings us back to the question I planted at the start. How does any of this disappear? We're talking about the worst maritime disaster in American history. We're talking about men saved by their former enemies. We're talking about a story with greed, corruption, heroism, and a body count larger than the Titanic. How does that not get told? The Sultana burned to the waterline. The current carried the hulk 6 miles downstream, where it sank in the shallows on the Arkansas side, near what is now Marion, Arkansas. It took about 20 minutes for the superstructure to go. The hull went under around 7 in the morning, 5 hours after the explosion. Of the roughly 2,137 people aboard, somewhere between 1,200 and 1,800 died that night, and in the days following. Of the approximately 800 who were pulled from the river and taken to Memphis hospitals, nearly 300 died of burns and exposure before the month was out. The survivors arrived at the hospitals naked. They had stripped off their clothes in the water to make it easier to swim. Men who had already been photographed at liberation, emaciated to skeletons, who had gained back some of their weight at the Vicksburg parole camp, arrived at the hospitals of Memphis burned, frostbitten, and barely alive. Captain Mason was among those who died. He was found in the river. At least he had the grace to drown with them. Here's what the newspapers said. On April 29, 1865, 2 days after the worst maritime disaster in American history, the New York Times ran a single brief notice under general news, not a headline, not a front page, a note buried inside. A private dispatch from St. Louis reports the explosion and sinking of the steamer Sultana on the Mississippi, place and date not given, and adds that a great many soldiers lost their lives. That was it. Lincoln had been shot on April 14th. John Wilkes Booth had been cornered and killed on April 26th, the day before the Sultana exploded. Confederate General Joseph Johnston had surrendered the same day. The country was not running out of tragedy. It was drowning in it. The eastern newspapers were consumed. The death of a boat full of soldiers from Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Michigan, Western men from states that weren't the center of the nation's attention, barely registered. Nobody was looking. Nobody was watching. And the people responsible made very sure to keep it that way. 3 military investigations were conducted. Captain Frederick Speed, the officer who oversaw the boarding at Vicksburg, was found guilty of negligently overcrowding the boat. The ruling was later reversed. Captain Reuben Benton Hatch, the quartermaster who had taken the bribe from Mason, who had guaranteed that overloaded boat, its human cargo, ignored 3 separate subpoenas to appear before the court. When a United States Marshal was sent to arrest him, Hatch was nowhere to be found. The courts determined they had no jurisdiction over a civilian. No one ever found him responsible. Nobody was ever convicted. Nobody was ever punished. Nobody served a day. The men who had died received a brief notice in the papers and were quietly forgotten. Their families received word that their sons and husbands and brothers had died on the way home after everything. On the last night, if you were to count the Union soldiers killed on the Sultana as casualties of a Civil War battle, the death toll would rank 11th among all Union losses in all battles of the entire war. More men died on that boat than in most of the famous engagements you can name. More men died that night than the Titanic would take 47 years later, when the world stopped to mourn for weeks. The survivors formed an association in December 1885. They met every year in Ohio. They told their stories to each other because almost nobody else wanted to hear them. The last survivor, Private Charles M. Eldridge of the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry, died in 1941. He was 96 years old. He had carried the Sultana with him for 76 years. In 1982, a Memphis attorney named Jerry Potter, who had spent years reading the court-martial records, all of them, every page, found the Sultana. She was on the Arkansas side of the river, buried under 32 feet of silt and soil, in a soybean field 2 miles from the water. The Mississippi River had changed course over the decades, moving east, leaving the wreck behind in dry land. Potter used sonar equipment to locate the dense mass below the field, blackened timber, deck planks, metal fittings. The Sultana, preserved by the mud that covered her, 2 miles from the river she died in. She has never been excavated. She is still there. In 2015, on the 150th anniversary, a museum opened in Marion, Arkansas, the town closest to where the wreck was found. Arkansas designated April 27th as Sultana Remembrance Day in 2019. A new, larger museum is under construction now, set to open in 2026. It has taken 161 years to get to a museum. The question I started with, how does the worst maritime disaster in American history disappear so completely, has an answer. It disappeared because Lincoln was dying when it happened. It disappeared because a war-exhausted nation could not absorb one more catastrophe. It disappeared because the men who died were poor, Midwestern, and politically inconvenient to account for. It disappeared because the men who were responsible worked very hard to make sure they were never held to account and succeeded completely. But there's one more piece of it, the piece that stays with me when I close the files. These men had already made it. That's the part. They had survived the thing that was supposed to kill them. Andersonville, where 13,000 men died, where 100 men a day died in August, where the drinking water was the latrine water. They had survived that. They had survived the march. They had survived the waiting. They were on the boat. They were singing on the decks. They were writing letters home. Jonathan Robbins, Michigan, 18th Infantry, letter written April 14th from Vicksburg, full of hope, dead 12 days later, 13 days from home. The unnamed woman who calmed the panicking men, who kept them alive in the dark until the fire reached her. Her name was not recorded. She calmed men into keeping their lives and gave up her own, and history didn't see fit to write her name down. The engineer Samuel Clemens, not the famous one, who was scalded to his bones and gave his testimony and then died, gone. Every one of these men had a family waiting, had already been written about in letters home, had already been celebrated in their town as the one who made it through. And then they were gone because a captain needed money, and a quartermaster wanted a cut, and a boilermaker's warning was inconvenient, and 2 other steamboats sat empty at the Vicksburg dock. Somewhere under a soybean field in Arkansas, the Sultana is still there, 2 miles from the river, 32 feet down. The men who put her there walked away clean.